Well, Thomas, we are up on YouTube. Say hi to YouTube
Good morning, YouTube.
before the show, and we're going to go into the podcast. So, a couple seconds of silence. Welcome to Timelines. Today we have Thomas O'Grady coming to us from Washington State, from Redmond, that is. He's got a PhD in mathematical statistics. I can't even say it. It's so hard to say. He must be a PhD. But it's something about mathematics and statistics and economics. It's those high-level things which are so important for us to forecast out what's going on. And he got his advanced degree or his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, one of my favorite schools. I have a lot of friends from there. Since the age of 12, he's been interested in being an entrepreneur. And there's so much more that goes along with what he's done to include working with a top secret clearance on Soviet type things, intelligence back in the old days. And, there's so much that you do. And we're talking about you, Thomas. And I'm going to sort of title you as an ace of all trades, as opposed to jack of all trades. Like I can be at times, you're the ace of all trades. So, Thomas, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that intro. Now I'll be embarrassed.
No. You've got a great show. Your podcast is actually wonderful. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and you've got a good podcast. You're on this new format where we're going to talk about your podcast, how you got into your podcast and what you do. And we want to talk about your background and how you got to where you are today. So that said, let's work backwards. You're podcasting now. How did you get into podcasting? And let's work backwards. Why do you podcast?
Oh, the reason I podcast actually was I was writing a book and I was doing some other things and I started to hear about podcasting in general. I didn't even know what it was. Let's say about 18 months ago, I didn't even know what it was. And this guy, John Lee Dumas, came and spoke to a bunch of us at a retreat that we were at. And that was my first sort of taste of it. And I met some other people. But what appealed to me was that part of my book and part of what I'm doing right now is the fact that I want to be able to pass on some of the stuff I'm doing. I was doing a lot of research for my wife and I as we get to retirement, et cetera. What are we going to do? Because right now, people 45 to 64, this is the economist part coming out in the statistics, 45 to 64 are considered the net savings years. Now, that's the time that we're supposed to be saving for our retirement. Unfortunately, people are being laid off, being replaced by younger workers. Their hours are being cut back so that normally this would be time where they'd save. And because it's the baby boom, their wages were suppressed anyway. And they're in danger. Quote, the title of the podcast, Life Unsettled. Now, on top of all of that, normally we were supposed to, particularly as males, we were supposed to die at 74, 75 years of age. Guess what? That unscheduled stop has been interrupted. Unfortunately for people, we're going to live possibly 90 plus. So now we have to figure out, if you're 50, you've got to figure out what you're going to do for the next 40 plus years. And I'm hoping that people realize and take a new perspective and realize they have so much future left, rather than thinking about, oh, what am I going to do and lie around and fish or hang out with the guys. They start looking at other things that they might do. I heard something on the Dave Ramsey show one time, not too long ago. 97% of people who are 65 years of age cannot write a check for $600. When you think about that, you better be planning your life well before then.
That's good. And it's lifeunsettled.com. You can go directly to your website and find that on iTunes by just putting Life Unsettled or your name. You put your name on there, Thomas O'Grady. I'm sure O'Grady will pop up too. I wondered about the title. That's very good. I've listened to a lot of your shows. I've probably listened. You have 40 some odd shows. I've listened to
44, 45th will come out on Thursday.
I listen to a lot of podcasts. I've listened to at least 10 of your shows, and they're very good advice, very good information. One thing, you can learn so much from podcasts.
Yes.
So,
I saw something recently. It was not just a little while ago. And it's funny because nobody even knew what a podcast was, as I say, a year to 18 months ago. I would mention a podcast a year ago and my sister would kind of scrunch up. What? Today, this was actually about 2 months ago. If you take the people that listen to podcasts, that far exceeds the number of the amount of time spent listening to AM and FM radio combined.
I can easily see that because I listen to very little radio now. And when I listen to podcasts, I'm listening to them all the time. For example, I have a cold, but I feel pretty good now. Thank goodness I can talk. That's one thing about having a podcast. You should have a couple of reserve shows. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning, took some cough medicine, went back to bed, but I threw a podcast on at 3 o'clock in the morning and listened to it. By the way, it was John Lee Dumas that I threw on. It was a special about sleep and habits. I thought it was hysterical. Here I'm 3 o'clock in the morning waking up. So, oh my gosh.
So you got to listen to something about sleep.
I have on my phone, smartphone, have got just maybe 15 or 20 podcasts that I go through. And I'm always adding and subtracting, and there's so many to listen to. How do you decide which podcast to listen to?
It's a combination of what I hear on them, what I see, and what they seem to be about, who the person is. It's sometimes not hard. If I see something in the top ratings, like my show is in the top ratings, so that draws a lot of attention. It's been 6 and 7 and what's hot. That helps you, but then you have to deliver, because if it's kind of like a radio station or something else. If somebody listens to a or radio program or a TV program, if somebody listens 2 or 3 times in a row and gets nothing out of it, you sort of end up deleting that and going on, and you probably never come back. I actually have a lot of people that have said to me, said that they were going to just get started, or I hear people telling each other their advices. Well, just get started, fix it later. Go ahead, don't worry about it. You'll improve over time. And if I know the person well enough, I usually try to explain, and I usually use the analogy because that's always easiest to do. And I say, did you ever see the book John Malloy's Dress for Success, or heard the expression first impressions and how important a first impression is? I said, so what you're doing is you're going to take your podcast and have a horrible first impression. How are you going to get and recover from that?
I didn't know about the 00 serial when I started. Actually, my first podcast I like, but you should go back and record that first 000 show, because a lot of people listen to that first show. I still do. I go back and listen to those first shows from different podcasters.
Right. And that is a good suggestion.
That's a good point. That's an interesting approach, because sometimes I say just get started and get going. But let's go backwards. You have an amazing background. Coming out of high school, you transitioned into the military, the Army. You had very high IQ, picked up for language school, and you did work in an intelligence field. Tell us a little bit about those early years and how you ended up where you did, doing work for intelligence, and what that led you.
It's actually kind of a strange sort of story, and probably one of these 1 in a billion chances that I was just lucky at. And here's the 1 in a billion. When I was growing up, my eyes were a little crooked, and because of that, I had people that just perceive you. When they look at you, they perceive you as dumb and uncoordinated. I had guidance counselors that literally would read off my national test scores, et cetera, turn around to my parents then and say, you can't always go by test scores. And then one of the next expressions out of their mouth were, have you ever thought about sending him to a trade school? Not everybody's good for college. Now, I was extremely shy, but at that moment, I was scared to death of having to go out and tell all my friends I was put in the dummies class. This is the people that would be, everything from autistic to troublemakers were stuck into, just sort of monitored. Well, my fear was such that I immediately asked, oh, please don't do that. And they would say, okay, we'll try it a little longer. So I went through school just hoping to stay out of that, with no expectations, no real dreams. And well, I shouldn't say no real dreams, because I used to sometimes lie on bed with my head down, just hoping someday to become average, quote, unnoticed. What happened to me, and I'm just going to skip over a lot, but you can just imagine what my thoughts were. I went out then and joined the military. And that was basically the timing that I was in. And I joined the Army Security Agency, the security agency. And at that time, that was a 4-year project. So what I did is I got in, and then during basic training in the 3rd week, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd week, they brought us all of us, which I think there were 4 of us, over to this building and asked us there to go choose what we wanted to do. So the first couple of people walked in and they just said, here, they gave them the form and said, here's how you fill it out, et cetera. I walked in and they said, oh, we all know what you want. You want languages. And I laughed. I said, no way. I said, I took 5 years of German and don't know anything. I didn't get along with the German teacher, et cetera. Well, it's probably more my fault, but that's neither here nor there. So I basically turned it down. It was extremely expensive. In today's dollars, actually last year's dollars, because I know a Chinese instructor that was teaching there. And it was $1 million for one student for 1 year because of the intensity and the small number of people they have per faculty member. So I went through there, turned it down. And fortunate for me was they sent us over the holidays. My basic training was over the Christmas holidays, and they sent us all home. 2 guys sat next to me on the train. These 2 guys changed my whole life. I wish there's some way I could reach out, touch them, thank them. They have no idea what they did, and they'd probably laugh and have a beer over it anyway. But they invited me to the New Year's Eve party. I went there. At the New Year's Eve party, I told them what happened. They said, oh, God, you got to go back and tell them you changed your mind because it's wonderful. It's beautiful. It's Monterey, California. And on top of that, they'll teach you how to learn a language. Well, the beauty part of it didn't have any effect or phase on me at all. But the idea that somebody might teach me to do something, that was really intriguing. So I went back, knocked on the door of this building. A captain answered, what do you want? And I quickly, I changed my mind.
You're a private too.
Yeah.
Going right
I was
to
a
see
private
the captain.
And to a captain.
That takes a lot of guts, by the way, especially as a private, a young private.
Yeah, well, guts are dumb, whatever. Anyway, he hollers over. The only other person in the building was a colonel. And the colonel said, what does he want? And he said, he wants to change his mind. And after they left, he said, ask him why he thinks he can change his mind. I said, well, I was told I was probably going to be invited back anyway and re-asked. So I just came over. And they asked me why. And I told them this because of my score. And I told them what the score was. They invited me in, and the score was high enough that they basically just went over and they called the National Security Agency on the spot and offered me any language I wanted.
And this is when you were just getting out of basic training. You're at boot camp, basically. Still call it boot camp.
I was in boot camp. It was only like my 6th week of boot camp or something.
But you're still in boot camp. Okay.
I'm still in boot camp.
You
yeah,
had
and
a
I just
little
walked
R&R.
over.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're
Well,
lucky the sergeant
was,
major wasn't there, or at least the first sergeant or the drill sergeant. You'd be toast.
I was toast a lot of times anyway in the military, but I always got out of it. I always was very good at.
If you're smart and capable.
I was very, very good. I could tell you a few stories, but.
So going on, you got into school, DLI, which for folks, DLI is down in Presidio, Monterey. Beautiful place, great place.
Oh, yes. If you've seen Pebble Beach Golf and Carmel, they were just literally over the hill, literally. We were on a hill, and I would take my car, drive over there, and I'd very frequently have my lunch on Pebble Beach or on Carmel Beach. So it was, but I don't want to make it sound too easy because actually at that time they told us that 70% of the people would be failed out, and that you would go across over to infantry, learn, go off to Vietnam, come back for your R&R, and then go back a second time.
You head to Fort Ord and then go to the infantry. Yep.
Exactly. Well, that stress caused a fair number of people to have nervous breakdowns. There were people committed suicide, et cetera. So the school was tough. There was no question about it.
I don't know if it's like that today.
No,
definitely not the same stress. I was there when you talk about Monterey. I was there the Saturday, Sunday before 9/11. I think 9/11 happened on it was a Monday or Tuesday, but I was there the weekend before, and they had shut down for the first time the road going through the post to civilian traffic. So they knew something was up.
Well, in talking about how it was then compared to how it is now, because they had that threat that they had hanging over us. Years later, I'll tell you what happened to me, and this was what changed a lot of my life, is what happened was I went to finish the course, and then just the last week, a professor sat down at the coffee shop with another student, myself, and told us that whatever we wanted to do, anything, would be far easier. That medical school, law school would be easier than this. And there's no question it would have been given the what happened to people. So I went back years later. We'll get back to this in a second, but I went back years later to thank the professor. And he said, "You were the best class we ever had, and we don't understand it. Just there's never been one since." And I didn't say anything to him about the threats and the things that we were under. But I mean, of course we're the best. We're worrying about death.
Right. That's a big motivator. It's a big motivator. I can relate to that a little bit because I really should do one more tour as a GS, but I just don't want to go back overseas.
Yeah. Well, what happened to me was
relate to
after that, and this is what changed me, is I thought, gee, if the military could make me push myself to the extent that they did for them, then maybe I could do the same thing for myself. And that was a big thing. And then the other thought was, because remember, I still didn't think very much of myself or very highly. I thought, gee, if the average person is rated like 100, and I didn't know what mine was, but maybe mine's a 90. Well, we only use 10% of our brain. But if I work 20% harder than everybody else, I'm at 10.8 and they're only at 10. So those two things through my mind motivated and pushed me and helped me push myself for the next 10 years.
What's the difference between somebody who doesn't apply themselves and somebody who works harder? And how do you work harder? It's not necessarily just putting more hours in, but there's more to it. So what are those differences?
Oh, there's lots of different things. Anything from the concentration and getting rid of distractions, et cetera. Even when I went to Hofstra University, before I went there, I decided I better learn how to study well. So what I did was I went and researched and found books on how to study.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting. So then when I went to Hofstra, what I did was I literally went a couple of weeks ahead of time, went to the bookstore, found out what the books were for the courses I was going to take. And I did this all the way through graduate school. I would get the books ahead of time so that I would start studying and reading them before that school would start. So for the first week. So in a sense, I would be a week ahead. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is it's important to be a week ahead because sometime during the semester, you may get a cold or the flu or something like this, and you're going to be behind. And you don't want that to happen in a short semester. The other thing is that when you're doing it, sometimes they don't start out at chapter 1 or chapter 2. They'll start out at chapter 3 and just assume that those are so easy they don't need to present them. And if that happens, you better know them ahead of time. There's actually sort of a third reason in a sense as well, because that preparation means that when you're walking into class, you already know the topic somewhat or largely, and there's only some missing pieces. So what you're listening for is the missing pieces while everybody else is sitting there listening to hear it the first time. So your questions are the ones to close the holes. They're sitting there not sure whether they should ask a question because they know so little.
That's great advice. Actually get a week ahead, and then you're digesting the material, and you're probably regurgitating it one more time because, like in class, you're getting it for
right. And then actually another part of it was that within about 2 hours after the class is over, glance and go through your notes. And your notes might be little things on the side of the book that you, as you were studying it, or the attendance in class. And the reason you do it 2 hours afterwards is because that reinforcement, you'll tend to retain about 80% of it. If you wait until the next day or so, you'll only retain about 20%.
That is so true. I have my little business, contact management, which I'm sure you're doing the same thing because I know you use Infusionsoft because I subscribe to your newsletter.
Okay.
And contact management is really important. So as soon as you get, I don't want these partisan cards in here. As soon as you get cards, you talk to somebody, you better write a note about them and get them in your contact management system. Or I forget a day or two later.
Right, exactly. Although I don't put the people who give me a card, I don't put them in my Infusionsoft because I don't want them to get sort of marketing type call things unless they specify that, yeah, I'd like to see your newsletter.
First of all, folks, Infusionsoft is probably the hardest CRM you'll ever find to initially start. I recommend that you start with MailChimp or Aweber. And then once if you're making money, because Infusionsoft is expensive. I started too soon. That's another story. We should probably talk about this because of the podcaster thing, but let me not go into it right now. You mentioned a couple of things. Hofstra, that's in Long Island, correct?
Right.
I remember that from being back at West Point. And the second thing is I meant to start the show by talking about your offer. You're writing a book and you have an
Right.
offer. Make sure I mention that at the end of the show. And I think it's a great offer. But you said something that really hit home. You said that time in the military, and your point was the time in the military built confidence that you could do things in civilian life that you never dreamed possible.
Well, it wasn't so much time in the military. It was because there's lots of friends and people I know that serve time. And that almost sounds like it's treated the way
It
some
is,
people
it
do.
is time. I've served
Right.
my time,
Right.
34
But
years active in reserve.
right. But what happened was realizing what I did and accomplished at the language school, I realized how I could push myself. And using that, then I went on from there and did the same thing at Hofstra. For example, what I did is I sat back first, I prepared ahead of time and realized, gee, if I'm going to go to school, there's going to be a purpose in it. And I'm going to go on to possibly law school or finance and MBA, whatever I was going to do. In order to get into the best possible graduate program, you have to do the best you possibly can. So I decided, wait a minute, the military had me put aside 4 years of my life, really social life, et cetera. Now, I really have a key 2.5 years, the second, third, and just half of the last year, because after that, I'm already accepted. So I've got 2.5 years to make a great impression. So I can put my social life on silent for a little while. 2.5 years is nothing compared to the next 60 years that I might have. And that's what I did. I also became very regimented in the amount and the way I studied and the hours I put in and time off, et cetera, like that. I kept in mind that 20%, so it wasn't just intensity. It was by myself in the library without distractions.
So your advice to the young soldier, sailor, Marine, coastie is apply yourself, but you've also made an offer to go out and speak in front of the groups, the retirees, the different groups of military folks. Every military base, by the way, has a 6-month program where they transition you on retirement. So if you're close to any base, Navy or Army or Air Force, they have that process, and everyone should take advantage of that. You'd be great to come in there and speak, and you've offered your time to do that.
Right. Actually, what happened was I used to run into military groups in the airports, which I'm in almost all the time, and I've probably done this over 100 times. And there might be anywhere from 2 to 5 people there, and I would ask them what they had done, where they had been, and I'd bring them through the scenario. And I said, could you ever have imagined being able to push yourself to that degree? And they'd always say, no. And then I would turn around and share what I had done and push myself. And they would say, oh, I'm going to do that. And then I'd say, one more thing. Keep in mind, because you will run across impediments. There'll be something that will hit your life. And it'll just say, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I want immediately when that happens, for that to be a trigger for something in the back of your mind to say, wait a minute, I did that. And pick 1 or 2 incidents you did in the military that were just unbelievable. And you say, gee, I did that. This is nothing. And then break through. So now what I'm doing is, and yes, I would love to speak in front of groups. Every single place I've spoken with these people, bar none, every single one of them said, I'm going to do that. And they were so excited. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. Because there is so much potential there. The distribution of IQs is the same whether you're talking about some ghetto, small southern town, industrial, burned out city area, whatever it is, the distribution of IQs is the same. The only difference is sometimes the environment and other things. And that's a lot of this is in my book.
One thing I'll say about the military that it varies a little bit. During when we needed a lot of folks in the military for the surge in 2006 and 7, you didn't have to have a high school degree. Now you have to have that high school degree. So they still have a level, but you're right. It varies tremendously, the skill sets of soldiers and sailors.
Right. But I'm not even talking about skill sets, because that person without a high school degree
could be a genius.
Could be a genius.
Yep.
Matter of fact, there are probably lots of them around. And that's why I mentioned I had the guy who I shared a room with for probably 1.5 years was from Watts in LA right after the riots. Now, I don't know. We never talked about it, but that's where he was from. But he was very, very smart, extremely smart. Yet I don't know. And I wonder what happened to him after he went back, if he went back into that same environment, et cetera, what his expectations and opportunities and other things would be.
Today you would know because most people, young folks, can stay in contact with social media, whether it's Facebook, wherever it might be. You carry the
Yeah.
relationships a lot longer.
Actually, I tried to get in contact with a few people. Actually, I was always in trouble with my platoon sergeant in basic training. I was, really permanent trouble. But anyway, I wanted to contact him, and I sent something to try to find out. Not, I said, I don't have to, don't have to tell me what his address or anything else is. Could you just pass on a note? I would like to thank him. And of course, they didn't.
Right.
But it was a shame because he could use it, and he had tough times with a lot of people, and sometimes he got a lot of criticism from things.
The military has changed a lot, I'm sure, since the Vietnam era. I started in the 80s as a young lieutenant out of West Point, and I've really been impressed with the quality of people in the military. I know when you were there, it was really a mixed bag. Even in the early 70s, they had a lot of issues, or late 70s, in the military.
Well,
Race riots, things of that nature.
Right, but where I was in the security agency. In the security agency, the average education was 2.5 years of college.
Mm-hmm. And a high IQ and intelligence and capabilities.
Is that what it stood for? I was always wondering how I got in there.
That's an interesting group of people. Had the opportunity to work with a lot of intelligence agencies in my last few years. So moving on, you decided, what made you get out of the military?
Well, actually, I had my interview for my last promotion, which was staff sergeant E6. That was right at the end when I hit my third year. I was just about to hit my third year, and that's when they said they wanted to promote me to E6. And in there, they asked me sort of the proverbial question that they always do. And I have this thing, I won't lie to people. I just won't avoid it. I'll say, let's change the subject or something, but usually I can just walk around it. But they asked me, are you going to re-enlist? Now, they're probably fairly used to people saying, oh, yes, 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 I love it. I looked at them and said, look, I wasn't married. I'm not married. And right now, the military has a very poor reputation in civilian world. And I would have to ask a woman not only to marry me, but to marry the military. And I thought that was it. I thought it was over, that was, but that was the honest answer. Went out, and later on the day, the person who was 2 levels above me that I talked to often was this warrant officer, Larry Eckert. And he comes up to me later on the day telling me that he's heard such wonderful things about my interview. And I was shocked and very pleased too, because it said not only a lot, but it said that he would tell me that, but also said a lot about the military people that did the interview.
Well, that's good. Be truthful is a good characteristic, fundamental thing that'll carry you through life. So you're out of the military now. What's happening? You go back. How do you pick up your PhD? How do you make a living? How do you survive? And you meet a wife somewhere in there too.
Yeah, I did.
Future wife.
Actually, one of the things I say in some places I've talked where people talk about networking, et cetera, and they have difficulty, they have trouble, and they're trying to tell people how to, find people, go to this, go to that. I tell the story about how I met my wife. She was behind me in line at an ATM machine. Yeah, I saw your eyebrows pick up when I said that. And I, just like I do everywhere I go, I started talking. It turns out the ATM was basically broken. And the person that was 2 people ahead of us that was at the ATM machine was arguing with it a bit. And then everybody started to slowly leave. And that's actually what happened. Now, actually, what my wife says, she tells the story a little different. She does it sometimes 2 different ways. One of which is I looked over his shoulder, saw his bank balance, and I would decide it was time to meet him. The other one she tells us, he was between me and my money. I had to meet him. But actually what happened was I walked out. And as I was walking out and knowing a lot about marketing, this is a good marketing case, marketing study. I had the conversation, and I get outside and I say, gee, I have to be someplace in 30 minutes. But I'd really like to continue this conversation. Now, the reason this is good in marketing is because you always think in terms of your customer. It's kind of strange to think about. But I'll tell you, for 10 or 12 years, my wife used to tell the story. God, when she hears this episode, I'm in trouble. She used to tell the story about how We both had to be someplace in a half hour. And finally, after it was about 10, 12 years into the marriage, I said, I got to tell you, I didn't have to be anywhere. And she said, what? I said, no. What? I said, listen, if I turned around to you and said, hey, let's go somewhere.
Yeah.
And I've said it that way sometimes in groups. And of course, the women all kind of laugh because they realize, of course, a woman by herself, no matter what the situation, is going to feel a little bit reluctant.
Mm-hmm.
But they maintain control, and you basically loosen the atmosphere a little bit if you say, gee, I'd love to continue this someplace.
That's a great idea. And for coffee, and that's
Exactly.
a nice, simple transition. And that's the way life is when you're working in business or with people. If
Exactly.
you're over aggressive, like we talked earlier about your marketing background and some of your approaches with this, the elevator speech.
Right.
That fits right in. That fits into the elevator speech. You didn't give her an elevator speech, but you've made another contact. You want to go in more depth, and there's something to be said.
I don't like the elevator speeches. I really dislike them.
I'm in a couple groups around town in Reno, Nevada. Wednesday's my day where I escape the computer. And one of the groups is a Snap networking, and they sort of teach people how to give that elevator speech. But you put a whole different light on that elevator speech. We break it a little bit here to point. I think it's a good point to go in. So what is your approach in business to making relationships? Is it it's got to be similar to how you develop that relationship with your wife?
Be truly, truly interested in people. I am. I like people. I like helping. I like doing it. It's like when I was mentioning about the military, which we never really kind of finished up. But when I was meeting people, I would just go up and talk to them everywhere and any place. And that was it. And that was so important. You mentioned in speaking, I would love to get the opportunities to speak to military groups. I hear about all the problems where they're lost after they get out because they don't have a direction, et cetera. I think one of the biggest problems is they don't realize what they can do and have the ability to do. And there's even, I'm hearing how many suicides, et cetera, there is.
Yeah, it is. It's way above average.
It's something like 22 a day.
I'm not sure why.
Well, I think what happens is they're coming out, they've done something that just doesn't seem like it's applicable in any way, and they're probably making the mistake of somehow trying to apply it to what they will do afterwards. And what they really have to know is, like I found out, how many skills I learned that had nothing to do with what I would do in the future. But it gave me the chance and the ability to know what my ability was. And that's what was important. So actually for my book, what I'm going to do, which is the introduction actually is somewhat, I would say, dedicated almost to, because it's about the transition I went through in the military, et cetera. And what I'm going to do with it is anybody that buys one, it's not released till later in the fall, anybody that buys one, they'll be able to supply an address to have another one shipped to somebody in the military. And hopefully that will hit a few people. I don't expect to save thousands of people, but I do hope that I just have that influence on some.
A good place to send some of those is to your APOs over in Afghanistan, to the USO, things of that nature, or even a bulk donation.
Right.
That's a good place. I'll tell you what, magazines and books were so precious when we go out into the forward operating areas. A magazine had so much value. What we read at night and during the day, it was like relief. I read a lot of magazines too.
That's actually good to hear, because all my chapters are like 5 to 8 pages, and there's probably 30 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that they're little pieces that people can contemplate and think a great deal on, and that there's 2 different sections, really. One it has to do is more evaluative, and the rest is sort of an action-oriented, what you can do.
And that's coming out in November. What's the name of the book?
The Mechanics for Breakthrough Success.
Mechanics for Breakthrough Success.
Yes. The idea is that these goals and things that people have, it kind of ticks me off some of the times that they set up goals, because they're usually something that you can see. And very often they'll say, in the argument is, they'll say, well, you don't know necessarily how you're going to get there. It's kind of like the shot to the moon. They shot the rocket off, but they were constantly adjusting it all the way through. That's really not the significant part of the problem. The significant part was back when JFK first said it, in whatever it was, 60, 61. When he said it, They had no idea how to attain and invent some of the things that had to be done before they could even shoot off that rocket. So that's really breakthroughs. Breakthroughs are things that you don't see that you can do. That's what I like really helping people with, is making those breakthroughs, because they can't see what they're capable of and what they really could do in the future. I've done it and been there.
Thomas, one of your podcasts, you talk about SMART goals, how they're really not goals. I remember that's one of my very first or second podcasts of yours I listened to. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. That's not a goal. I was not arguing. I was talking to a friend who's big into SMART goals. I said, like, these aren't goals. These are like tasks. These are little short tasks. And when I heard your podcast, it all came together. I said, yeah, they're definitely not goals.
Right, exactly. Because SMART goals, literally, if you can define them that well, you know how to get there. That's not a goal.
Maybe SMART tasks, we should call
them. And the people that designate that you have to do them are called smart asses.
or officers who write operations orders. That's like you'll find a quote unquote SMART goal in an operations order. If you look at it, it's right there. You know, the mission, the execution, how you do it, and the time you have to do it, command and communication. It's all right there.
Oh yeah, exactly. And if you have assigned a SMART goal, what you've basically done, because you know how to get there, you've eliminated creativity, because someplace in the next few months, you're going to have something that you're going to see that really needs to be done and would be a major improvement in the performance of your company or military operation. The problem is the people who design SMART goals turn around and say, well, yeah, you can always go and change them. You just ask permission and we rewrite and stuff like this. That's difficult to near impossible and a pain in the butt to do.
Right.
Your boss has to go and then get it approved and submit it and everything else. So what it does is it stifles, if not completely eliminates, any kind of creative ideas.
Very good. So driving on, how did we get through the military? You've got your PhD. You got that fairly young. How old were you when you finished up your PhD from Berkeley?
I was in my early 30s. I'm going to say 32, 33.
Dr. O'Grady, yeah, 32. That's young. That's very, very young to have a PhD.
Well, it depends on what, that was young because I had 4 years in the military.
Plus the military. Yeah.
That's it, because I had 4 years in the military. But otherwise, it's not so young, because people coming straight from high school, going right through, and depending on where they went, I mean, going to Berkeley, that's a big jump. Actually, going from Hofstra University to Berkeley was an almost insurmountable jump.
East Coast, West Coast.
Well, not just East Coast to West Coast, but everybody else from my class at Berkeley, they went to MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, Princeton, Yale, Cornell. So all top schools. And here I came from Hofstra University. They all already knew what the graduate program was about and all had attended or audited the first year graduate program. I didn't. So that was a very scary first year. But I made it through.
You made it, and you said it took you 6 years to go from your master's into your PhD in two different fields.
Well, not master's, from BA, from bachelor's.
Oh, right into PhD.
Right to PhD. Actually, there is no master's for economics out of Berkeley.
We could go in and talk about those two specifics to the nth degree, but I would like to go into a little bit of depth, not so much about math, but about that economics. What do you learn from the economics degree or the PhD in economics?
Well, the main thing was the causality and understanding of the marketplace, et cetera. But I'd say causal relationships was probably most important. And since I had done, because of the statistical, the mathematical and statistical applications to economics, I understood and I tested a lot of things out for how economic theory might be put together on a micro level. I don't like macroeconomics. I'll just put that right out there. Sorry, all those people that are listening. But no, because macroeconomics, if you listen to everything that everybody says, they're talking about trends and this stuff. Well, right now, today, none of those things are valid. And the reason I say they're not valid is because trends rely on the underlying structure maintaining a constant backdrop. That is, those are the assumptions. Well, when you remove them or change the assumptions as they have, then all of a sudden that those trends no longer, the correlations between them and everything else no longer work. I'm actually doing an episode on this on my podcast next week. So, but what I got out of it was really understanding and being able to have an attuned customer perception, business perception of what derives, what is demand. I used that very thoroughly, not only when I went off to the research labs, which I had a couple of things that really, actually one thing I was really amazed at is I extended a work of a Nobel Prize winner to apply it to some things in a new area in General Motors research labs. And that, as of about 7-8 years ago, was still being used to evaluate what kinds of improvements they should make on their cars, which was kind of neat, that was still valid 30 years later.
And that, truths don't change or facts don't change.
Right. But it happens that, you would think that could somebody derive or come up with a more advanced or anything statistical technique, and nobody has been able to since, which is kind of neat. And then I used it very much when I went over to Chase and headed the automotive division. And that's where I got not only started into being interviewed a lot by the media, but also built the relationships that I did with everybody from Lee Iacocca to Alan Greenspan, et cetera. Actually, Alan Greenspan was after I left Chase and went on my own company. Actually, leaving, what happened was they were being closed down for assets, sold for assets only. And 4 companies said, gee, if you would set up a company of your own, we'll be clients. And it was scary because there's a lot involved in that. I'm here as an individual person. It's setting up databases, forecasting, and everything else. And so finally I decided to do it. It was because Chrysler, Mitsubishi, TRW, and Mazda all said that.
What year was that?
Oh, gosh. 1983.
83.
Yeah. And what happened was I decided to do it. I got my non-compete clause signed off on, so I was no longer restricted by that. They were selling for assets only, so they didn't care. Well, 1 week before I was leaving, the deal fell through, and they had to stay in business. So as I left and I had my own company, this was me all by myself. My chief competitors, 4 competitors, were Chase Manhattan, Merrill Lynch, McGraw-Hill, and Thompson Publishing. Now, you might not know this, but they did have deeper pockets.
Yes. But I think I've heard you talk just recently about success and some of the excuses that people use, and one of them is capitalization, not having capitalization.
Yeah, I don't use that term only because that can scare people. But
yeah, I forgot what you used, but it was not.
I think I talked about financial, because one of the biggest things for failure, about 70% supposedly of business that fail, is financial management.
Right.
And it's not necessarily just capitalization, but also how they handle it, how they handle the flow of cash, et cetera, because you can have a lot of business and you can fail successfully. And that is, you're so successful that before you get a chance to both deliver everything and then a month or so later receive your money, you have no money to pay your employees or anything else. You've run out of cash.
Yep. Cash management. I've heard you speak about those concepts, that those aren't excuses. I mean, if you want to make it, there's ways to make it. And
there are ways to make it, and you have to, well, one is you find people that know how to do it and listen to them. That's what I did all my life.
Well, Dr. O'Grady, you've done so much. You have such an unusual story. That's why I say a master of all, really an ace. What do we use the word ace of all trades, or a master of trades? You've done so many different things. I want to try to get to this final element, but in sort of pulling it all together, we'll have you back when your book launches, and maybe we'll go in a little bit more detail about your later life and how you evolved with the book. But is there anything that you can bring to light that you did between the time you moved from one place to another? You didn't stay in one place. You moved your entrepreneurial cycle. You were in the military. You worked for businesses. And 83, you started your own business? Is that like the next phase that you're in?
Right. Yes.
And then you brought it where you are today. So where are you today? You've written a book. This is your first book, correct?
No, actually, I wrote a book. I read the Database Developer's Guide to SQL Server.
Oh, yeah, a tech book.
Yeah, tech book.
You're a tech writer.
Tech book. Very, very high.
I forgot about that, the SQL Server.
Right. And actually, while I was in the military, I really liked what I was doing because of what I was put in charge of such a huge operation as far as territory, et cetera, and what was supposed to be done, that I wrote 3 manual/books there. I mean, by
Right.
standards of pages, they'd be called books, but we call them manuals there, that were then passed on to the NSA. And that was just, and I really did that, you could really say, largely in my spare time, in evenings and stuff like this, because I wanted to be able to pass on to the people who would follow me anything and everything I've discovered, rather than just leaving and the next person trying to learn from ground zero.
We always had to build I can't even say it. Continuity files. It's one of those days. But, so people can follow what we've done, because that's what the beauty of the military is. Even though it's very strict and regimented, they're still given a lot of freedom, especially the American military, to create and evolve.
Yeah, these were a little deeper because the one was on Russian procedures, operations. Another one was on analysis of Russian procedures, concepts.
Okay. So
that's as best as can be explained.
So is there a book out there like How to Succeed in Podcasting or the digital media? This is, I call it, it's more than podcasting. I call it new media. We're in a new media environment, which is really changing the rules. We'll finish up before we go into our life principles or success principles. But new media, how do you test out new media? We've got Google Analytics, of course, but this new media business is really going to change a lot of things. So what do you see is the future? What do you see those changes occurring?
Well, I think a lot of it is right now. It's actually kind of interesting because I saw John Lee Dumas talk about on something right at the podcast movement, saying that it's really overcrowded already. And to a large extent,
he said that at the podcasting movement?
Yeah, and it's actually kind of funny because
I don't think so.
Well, in some ways, in some areas, it is, because there are an awful lot of people copying the same thing. What they do is they see somebody else doing it. You've probably had these conversations with people, and they say, "What are you going to do?" "Oh, I started a podcast." "Oh, what are you doing? What's your audience?" They don't know what their audience is, and they don't know where they're going to take it or why they're doing it. It's kind of like, this looks like neat and fun, and I can make money at it, and they have no idea. And without knowing what your target is and all that other stuff, what kind of business is it? Can you imagine opening up a store? I'm going to sell things.
No.
I have no idea.
That's a good point. Good way to look at it. Let me say one thing, though. I can say that I'm trying to do a lot of podcasts from interviewing people actually in Reno, and I mix it with people like yourself who don't live here. Great combination. It brings a lot of interest. But in Reno, there aren't many podcasters. This is wide open. I was just talking to Steve Lee from Tehachapi this morning, who has 8 podcasts, well known, is the promoter of International Podcast Day. And he has already started a show, which I thought about a year ago, and I pitched it to some business guys, is where you get 2 reporters, male and female, little cams. You go out and you do the cams during the day, and then at 5 o'clock, they put it together. At 6 o'clock, they put it live, and they actually do it live, where it's streamed. They record it. They put it up on a podcast. They've got it on YouTube. Now you can watch the news from that little town in Tehachapi. Every town needs something like that. And
that's a great idea. And you can literally do it in every town and get a lot, and then you'd certainly get advertisers.
Every town needs a podcast. If you start doing a podcast in a small town of 20, 15,000 people, eventually you're going to interview that whole town, and everyone's going to listen.
Right, exactly. Plus, it's how it applies. I mean, I always go and turn on my local news every day, even though, see what the weather is.
Yeah,
I can tell you what it is ahead of time.
You could do that with a podcast.
Exactly. You could do the same thing with a podcast.
You could do that with podcast. In fact, I was listening to ABC News until they took it offline. I'd record it and then watch it on here. And now it's only on audio. It was on visual too. It was really good.
Yeah. The part of the problem is you better have a partner or two so that you can leave the town sometime to travel.
Yeah. Well, and it takes some money, but it doesn't take as much money as running that TV station.
No, not at all. And that's one of the parts, and that's one of the things I like about helping entrepreneurs, because when I'm helping them, a lot of them don't realize the opportunities available to them to expand their market tremendously.
A lot more opportunity right now in podcasting than there is in buying a radio station.
Right. And it also take a look at what you look at podcasting for. I mean, as you're talking about it right now, you're talking about a news side in a sense, but a lot of podcasting is trying to get people interested in a show that targets some topic, et cetera. And you have to make sure that you have the topic, that you're on target, that you're meeting the audience's needs, et cetera, so that it is newsworthy to them and interesting and important to them.
Right.
The way I've hit my numbers of 6 and 7 in what's hot is I'm looking at my audience, targeting them exactly with what I think is necessary. Now, it's interestingly, I've had, 24-year-old girl writes down on one of my reviews, this may be targeted for older people, but boy, we need this too. And, you're going to hit a much broader audience. But the idea is you keep yourself honest by making sure you're on target.
So going back, the baby boomers are your audience, basically your target.
Yeah, really sort of the 45 to 64 age
like
group.
you
Actually,
said,
probably
whatever.
45 to 60, something like that. People that can still turn around and say, okay, I can resurrect my life and change things and get there.
Very good. So that's a good transition. We're going to go into the final section, which is my favorite, and it's success or life principles. And you have like 20 or something in your book. We've pulled out a few today, and I was going to, do you want to read them out? And then we'll go back
Well, you
over
read
those?
them out because I actually didn't
Okay.
write them down when I was telling them you.
This is my favorite part, and this is how Timelines has transitioned from interviewing a P-38 pilot from World War II to interviewing Dr. O'Grady today. What we do is at the end is we talk about either life principles, which I think are really life principles, and success principles, because life principles make your life go. And Dr. O'Grady put out one as and there's no order to these. Avoid the word can't, copy well, know your weaknesses, and go on a diet. The difference, I got to move my notes over because they're behind another note. The differences between wisdom and knowledge. I may have written this one down. Peers, friends, and family can be harmful. Aim for number one. Visualize, sacrifice. I added another ninth to yours because you mentioned it throughout your discussion. And I said, be truthful.
Oh, right.
I added
right.
9 because I think that ties what you are in. You've been truthful, straightforward your entire life.
Yeah, that's important. Well, the change and the transition was really when I realized that I looked at things, and actually it probably occurred while I was in the military.
Yeah.
Which was interesting because you have an officer asking you a question and you won't lie, but you certainly don't admit what you did. I mean, I had an officer one time say to me, did you say that? Did you mean this to you, to me? Which I basically, what I was doing, I said something cryptically that was very insulting to him.
Right.
I was not going to lie. I was not going to say, no, I didn't. But I also knew I was in deep trouble if I said, yes, I did. So I just looked at,
go ahead.
I looked at him straight in the eye and just said, how could you ever imagine that I could say something like that to you?
That's your early marketing. So we'll talk about that and we'll finish up with that. And I'll go in a little discussion myself. So number one, avoid the word can't.
Right. As soon as you say the word can't, you're done. You're cooked. It's over. And really, this actually, when I had my company, which grew very large after Chase, what happened was I would never permit the word can't. And I'd have sometimes these people come up, this one guy in particular, I know you don't like this word. I said, then don't say it. Don't say it. Try to say everything else you need, but don't say that. The reason for it is think in terms of like a math problem. You have something, you have certain assumptions, and you have to prove something. It's the same thing with we're going to reach the moon. Now, if there was the idea that can't, soon as something stood in their way, they'd say, well, we can't do it. Instead, you solve everything you possibly can do, and then you enumerate what you're having trouble with, or that you need more time for, or you need help with, or you need assistance with. Somebody else might have the solution. But if you never look at the word can't, you'll always be looking for the answer. And if anything, you'll minimize what your difficulty is.
Very good. Number two, copy well. This is going to be interesting. I'm clueless. Copy well. And we talked about not copying, but now you're saying copy well.
Right, exactly. Because what happens if you take a look at how the Japanese succeeded? They basically copied precisely. Now, the consideration there is to truly copy exactly. Something that's actually been repeated and quoted of mine off and on is master what the master has already done. What you're doing there is take a look at the Japanese when they went into electronics, watches, etc., cameras. What did they do? They copied the Germans, they copied the Swiss. And early on, those looked like they were basically exact copies. Then later on, only after it's done and you truly is mastered, then do you make changes. But statistically, you should only make one change at a time. I actually had somebody on a podcast group discussion one time, and some woman said, "Gee, that's wonderful. I know what I can do then." Yes. And along the way, I know of some of my own ideas I can put in there. I said, "Wait, stop. You put none of your ideas in." I mean, can you imagine? Let's say you wanted to be a great golfer. So you copy Spieth. Would you be satisfied being the exact duplicate of him? I think so. So why are you going to stick your own muck in the way?
Yeah, or Ben Hogan. I loved golf when I was young, and I studied Ben Hogan to the nth degree. But you know what?
Right.
That copy well. You mentioned the Japanese and Deming, of course. That could be another discussion of how Deming's principles applied. I don't know if you even like some of those concepts. But my family had a ceramics company. I employed 40 people, had beautiful buildings. They kept a lot of cash, which is good. And they were one of the first casualties of the Japanese recovery, because one of the first places they started exporting to the United States was ceramics. They basically ran our ceramics business out of business. But that said, my dad and my uncle, and this is in the 50s, my uncle had a chemistry degree from San Jose, and they started to experiment with plastics. You know, go ahead to the 1970s. They were one of the designers of the first heat shuttle for the space shuttle, where you take plastics, wet inside ceramics. So they combined ceramics and plastics and got into niches where the Japanese couldn't beat them. But the Japanese actually threw their commercial ceramics business out of business.
Right, exactly. And actually, there's reasons the Japanese have trouble. But what you do is you take the best of every group. So you take the best of what the Japanese do at copying, but they're not creative.
They copied verbatim. They had painters and stuff back here, and they did a lot of artistic work. And that was very, in the 50s, American ceramics was some of the best. And they copied verbatim off the models, off the ceramics parts, the same pieces, verbatim.
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about it, there's actually some stories in my book about how we failed at that, and how, for example, the general manager of Chevrolet had tried to get his people to copy something from Honda Accord.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficulty he had, the discussions he had with his underling, who was an engineer. And that really changed it.
Yep. Hey, if you don't mind, I'm just regressing. Deming, I had to go through the Deming training in the Air National Guard or Air Force. And that's the idea of constant improvement. Any thoughts?
Well, what Deming was really geared towards was, and that's really what his background and what he was doing, was the idea of measuring things to see that you would reduce your errors over time. And that was a constant thing. It's been brought out to a lot of things on that. And that's very good. And that's very, very important.
Yeah, MacArthur brought Deming to Japan to help them get going. Oh, crap. We froze. Well, folks, we're still on. Hopefully it'll come back up. This is on, I don't want to have to split. Hate to split these episodes. This usually doesn't happen. We've been recording for 1 hour, and we are off. So I will have to splice them. Come on back. If he comes on back. You still there? Okay. Let me see if I can bring this video back. And we'll take it out of the middle. Well, folks, that's the way it goes.
Okay.
Well, we're back with Dr. O'Grady, and Dr. O'Grady had a power failure, and he had a backup power source, but it didn't help the internet. So haven't had that happen in a long, long, long time where we actually had a drop. So up in Washington State, your cable provider, whoever it is, or your broadband, who's your broad? Well, I don't say. We don't want to get it.
It's Verizon.
Yeah, I generally am really happy with broadband cable. It works pretty darn well.
But it's not cable, and it wasn't that. It was actually the electricity itself. Power went out.
Oh, for the whole thing.
So yeah, the whole house is out right now.
Wow, and it is a little dark, but amazing. Only 2 podcasters with some technology would get back up like this.
Right, and actually it was fairly easy. What I did is, since I have a battery backup, a good one, which you can sort of hear beeping in the
Mm-hmm.
background.
I can hear it. That's okay.
Well, as a reminder for everybody what we're doing, rather than trying to figure out how to squelch it. But what it does is I have a hotspot, which is a Verizon, so I just put it out there. I sometimes carry it around because, like, if I'm at a Starbucks or something like this, and I have to do something that's a secure transaction,
Oh,
I
yes.
I use that. I don't use any hotspot that's out there that's public. I only use my own, hotspot for that, which is heavily encrypted.
My business, one
So,
thing we do in Reno is we stream live. I've actually used my iPhone to stream live through with our setup
right,
with that hotspot. It's a pretty amazing tool.
right.
Very good. So let's drive on our conditions here. We did avoid the word can't, copy well, know your weaknesses, and go on a diet. I don't think we got there yet.
No, we didn't. No,
Copy
we
well.
didn't.
We're talking about did we
Everybody's always
sidetracked?
everybody's always talking about find your strengths and go after your strengths. Don't worry about your weaknesses. I'm sorry, but quite frankly, if you have weaknesses, many of those weaknesses are very, very important to get rid of. And there are a wide range of things. I'll just mention some of the ones that everybody should work on, no matter how good you are. Write better, speak better, dress better, dress more properly, whatever you want to call it. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that you wear, the shirt and tie. What I mean is you could be wearing a t-shirt, but I hope you took a bath or a shower. I hope you've learned how to comb your hair or have a haircut or something like that. Look like you might be serious for whatever you're doing. So there's a lot of different things, but also speaking, whether it be public speaking or just speaking with other people. I was extremely shy at the time. If you cannot speak well, how are you ever going to be in a situation where you have to make presentations, where you might be interviewed by the media,
Right.
etc.?
Work on speaking. So next thing is number 4, the difference between wisdom and knowledge.
Right. A big, big difference. What I do is, this is my definition. I think it's a very good one, but if it's not tough, it's the one we're using. So what happens is that what I look at the difference between wisdom and knowledge is wisdom is the thing that you can't really prove, whereas knowledge is something that you can actually look through and logically deduce and explain to somebody. Have you ever had those things where somebody gives you some advice or suggestion or something like this, and you have a different view and you're talking back and forth and you just really you can't buy theirs and they can't buy yours. They can't explain to you what's wrong with yours, but you can explain. I was sitting in church back, I was probably about 10 years of age at the time, 10 or 11. It was only because where we were living and what the church was, and I can still picture it. And I'm sitting there and I was thinking about the fact that we're constantly being taught these things, and every generation's being taught the same damn things. Over and over again, we're being taught these things, and we're having to get these, and we have to grow up learning this stuff. It's stuff that you only acquire through experience. That would be called wisdom. Whereas the things that you could read a book and learn it or get an idea, that would be fine. That would be knowledge. What's important about it, and what's absolutely crucial, it says to you that there are some people that if you truly respect the position and the person that's doing what you admire or what you think has very good, strong background, you can turn around and just copy what they say. Take their advice. You're better off than that. Now, the backup, by the way, is starting to ding faster and faster.
So we'll go quick. By the way, we are in the information age, which is changing how we get our knowledge. I mean, it's easy to get more factual, truthful information pretty darn fast if you know how to do it. And the other thing, too, is I led PhDs overseas, and they all have their opinions, and they're very strong.
Right, exactly. And what you have to do is you have to ask a lot of why questions, because very frankly, a lot of PhDs don't have the fundamental understanding behind what they're doing. That's one of the best things I got out of Berkeley.
You know what?
Incredible.
Most PhDs, except for one who I really have huge admiration for that I worked with, most of them I found were very narrow. In fact, one of my missions as a lieutenant colonel was keeping these guys alive because they were missing some of the skill craft to stay alive. Did not know that that's dangerous. Do not go there.
Right.
It's an interesting dynamic because they're so focused. I don't think they have that problem. You're diversified. You've spread out.
And actually, I used to get that all the time when I went to different places and stuff like this. They were amazed that I was able to communicate and talk as well as I was to different groups.
And you started your PhD very young. I still consider you had the military, but you're still really young. This PhD actually paid for his PhD after the age of 40. A UCLA guy. Okay, let's drive through this. Peers, friends, and family can be harmful.
Right, exactly. You've heard about having the 5 closest friends, et cetera. Your income would be the average of those. Well, it's not just that, it's your environment and everything else. Your family or friends, one, they may not want you to go drift off away from them as you're moving and making progress, but they also may have fears for you. They see something that you're doing that's not only outside your comfort zone, but it's outside their comfort zone, which by definition means that they're uncomfortable with you doing it. They will hold you back and restrict you. That leaves alone, because there's many dimensions to this particular thing. It also leaves alone the idea that there's jealousy involved. If you go off to do something, I had a lot of slack from a friend of mine when I went to language school. Oh, what'd you do that for? We won't be together.
Right,
No.
right. That does happen. So
Oh, yes.
let's go through this. Aim for number one.
Absolutely aim for number one. If you don't aim for number one, you might only get to number 3 or 4. But if you aim for the top 10, you'll be lucky to make 7 or 8.
Right. Always aim
So what
high.
you have to do is always aim to the top, not just high, the top. You learn from others, you learn from,
Come on.
et cetera, but rather learning, see what they're doing, see how to do it, see how to improve yourself.
Well, I say our internet's starting to tweak a little bit, so we'll drive through these. Visualize.
Visualize literally everything. If you've ever seen Lindsey Vonn at the top of the ski slopes in 2010 in the Winter Olympics, you'd see her bobbing her head going through before she started off. She actually went through and did the whole run before she did it. I was taught that early on. Actually, when I was in the military, my guy who taught me weightlifting, he taught me to visualize. He was a champion. He actually won the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico tri-state heavyweight division in powerlifting. So, I mean, he was a true champion. And there was one time I walked up, I was about to start exercise. I was in a rush. I couldn't even pick up the weight. And all of a sudden I backed off and said, wait a minute. And I stood there for a second, et cetera. Then I went there and I had no trouble doing 3 sets of 12.
Very good.
But
sacrifice.
Sacrifice is just like an investment. We talk about investing in things and having over time that investment accumulating. So you put $100 aside every month, et cetera, from the age of 20 to 65, you're going to have a couple $1 million based on, growth, et cetera. Well, it's the same thing with investing in yourself. You have to sacrifice some things. You have to put a little bit of time aside. If everybody wants to go and do something, do you do it, or do you put the time into finishing up your studies?
Very good. And I added be truthful because I sort of that brings sort of your mantra, what you've done. And we talked about being truthful just a bit.
Right. To me, that's very, very important in a multitude of ways. One is you get tremendous respect from others, but much more important than the respect from others, you can get respect for yourself. You can sleep at night. I mean, many people have said to me, well, and they would ask me about it. And I said, quite frankly, I can sleep at night. That's the most important thing. I feel good about myself.
Very, very good. And the book, it's The Mechanics of Breaking Through Success.
Mechanics for Breakthrough Success.
Mechanics for Breakthrough Success. Very good. And that's coming out. That'll be out in November?
Yes.
Well, definitely like to have you back on when that comes out. I'm sure you'll be busy doing a lot of interviews and podcasts then.
Looking forward to it.
Very good. And
I really feel good about the book. Really feel very proud of it.
It sounds good. It sounds like if you listen to your podcast, it's coming out of that message from your podcast too.
Right. Yes, little bits and pieces.
Well, Dr. O'Grady, how can we get a hold of you? What's the best contact? Your website?
2 ways is if you go to my website, lifeunsettled.com. Lifeunsettled.com, there you can leave me a voice message. You can send me a message there as well. You can also contact me directly at thomas@lifeunsettled.com.
Very good. And we'll have that information at podcastershome.com as well as on Timelines at timelinesofsuccess.com. Dr. O'Grady, thank you for coming on the podcast today. Stay on for a few minutes and we'll stay on YouTube until your system collapses in minutes.
Yeah, I have no idea how long the APC power backup power source will work, but all of a sudden it'll tell us, and then we'll have to call on a phone.
Well, congratulations. Hey, real quick advice, 2 minutes of advice. How do we, what do you think the best way to stitch this with Adobe Edition, Adobe products? What you mentioned. I'm not a big stitcher. I've had problems. There's a lot to learn on the Adobe systems.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
What's the easiest way to stitch these two together, you think? And still get the same?
Basically, since we've just done it, literally just turn around and take them, put them one after the other, see what is there, and you may find out that you might trim off a little bit out of the first part or a little bit out of the second.
What product do you think? I use Adobe Edition, of course, which doesn't work with video. I have the Adobe Suites, and I use
that's Adobe Edition.
I use another
Adobe Premiere Pro.
Adobe Premiere Pro. That's a tough program. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, there is, but what you're trying to do will be just take the two, because it looks just like Audition, but it is tougher. And you take the two and put them next to each other, and then you can just decide how much you cut out.
Well, folks, if you're watching on YouTube, that's my advice from Dr. O'Grady. Can't even think here. It's a long episode. I really normally don't do this long of episode, but you're I won't say the word complicated, but there's so much to you. It's definitely not. You talked about John Lee Dumas, and we're off the podcast now, but we're still recording on YouTube. It sounds like John Lee Dumas led you into podcasting.
Well, he didn't really lead me so much, but he was actually, I didn't really know exactly very much about him, but he was the first person that interrupted and basically mentioned the stuff called podcasting. And then there was another meeting where there was Michael O'Neill was there, Chris Cerrone were there, and got to know and meet them.
His avatar are millennials.
Whose avatar is millennials?
John Lee Dumas.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, it's millennials. It's people like his age, 35. And I discovered him too. When I came back from 2012 in December from Afghanistan, I was pretty beat up after 40 months in a 5-year period of doing this program. And I watched YouTube for like 2 months, and I was working on some family projects. But I caught a podcast, and then I started to learn how to podcast. Then I heard his podcast, and I connected with it right away because of his military background.
Right.
It's I think he's really changed podcasting and opened it up to a lot of different people.
It's interesting what he's done and how he's done it. I like it as a very good model of how he developed his business. And you could see from ground zero all the way. I think a lot of these things he's doing and has done up until fairly recently, I think he's gone a little more extensively recently, were probably pretty much the original plan.
Yeah. How do you think he came up with this plan?
Well, it's very, it's very similar to other things that you would do in business. What he basically was doing, and he turned around and decided he was going to do something different than once a day, every single day, which was an awesome task. But by doing it, he was setting himself with a unique niche and becomes.
We're losing it. We'll have to catch this next cycle, folks. This is the fun of podcasting. We're losing the system. Dr. O'Grady was a great, wonderful interview. Learned a lot of information. Looking forward to his book. I'm going to pledge to buy a couple extra ones so he can send those extras to soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and Coasties. Thank you, Dr. O'Grady. I don't know if you can hear you. We can't hear you. But it was a wonderful podcast. Now I get that extra work of doing the work behind the scenes, which is the editing. So thank you, Dr. O'Grady.